Hey, and welcome to Module 4, Lecture number 1, or Lecture 12 overall. This lecture is about the prophet Isaiah and the book of Isaiah. So, in the class so far, we have been generally looking at the history or the narrative of the history of Israel. And now we're going to switch and we're going to look at some of the literature that was produced. It's important to remember that literature is written within a historical context. So the things that were happening in Israel and in Judah um, have a major effect on the books of the prophets and the wisdom literature and all of those types of things. There are what's known in the Old Testament as the major prophets and the minor prophets. Now, some people, when they think about major and minor, think, oh, the major ones must be the more important ones, and the minor ones must be the least important ones. Well, that is not the case when we're talking about major and minor prophets in the Old Testament. Major just happens to do has to do with the fact that the major prophet books are the big books, the big prophetic books, and the minor prophet books are the smaller books. So that's not rocket science. Um, so the major prophets are Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. And in Jewish history, those are known as the latter prophets. So let's jump right into the material, starting with Isaiah. Isaiah is undoubtedly one of the most well-known of the prophetic books. This is probably because it gets quoted all the time in the New Testament. It's a massive book. There's 66 chapters in Isaiah, so it takes a while to read. If you're just to read the whole book from beginning to the end, you would be brought through a journey of shame, hope, judgment, and holiness. Prophetic books can oftentimes bring the reader through an emotional roller coaster. What's important early on to know about prophetic books is that they're always grounded in the historical events that are taking place around it. This is to say that if something tragic or something great happens, and then a prophet comes along and he talks about what that tragic or great event means or will mean for the people, they can help the people deal with grief or joy, or even help people to prepare for grief or joy, all the while trying to ground the people in what really matters. So let's talk a little bit about Isaiah here. As a side note, some of you who have read Isaiah may take special interest where it talks about the suffering servant in the section that many Bible scholars call Second Isaiah. Many equate this suffering servant as being a prophetic notion or a prophetic idea of Jesus, the Messiah. Since we're not going to have time to really dive into that discussion, I've included in this module a short essay by Hubbard and Dearman that tries to analyze the passage from a neutral standpoint to help stimulate some critical and textual thinking about just what Isaiah was getting at as God inspired him to write this passage. I want to say about I think about the authorship of Isaiah, and again, I want to give credit where credit is due to David Nonemacher, who put this course together. So when I talk about Lord of the Rings references, this comes straight from Nonemacher. It's his idea, and it's a good one. So the first thing I'd like to mention about the book of Isaiah is its authorship and how it was written. Prophetic books are oftentimes a collection of specific prophetic sayings. So Isaiah didn't just sit down and start writing the book of Isaiah and sit there and come back to it and write the next day and the next day. That's not how books of prophecy work. Usually they're a collection of specific prophetic sayings. Sometimes the sayings are written by the prophet himself. Sometimes they are written down by people who are listening to the prophet speak. Even if someone else's hand does the writing and interpreting, authorship in the ancient Near East, thousands of years ago, is still attributed to the source. So if you're listening to me and you write down what I'm saying, and I'm a prophet, and you write down the things that I'm saying, then even though you're the one that wrote it down, it's still attributed to me. I think that would make sense, right? And that's what's happening oftentimes in the ancient Near East. That type of authorship doesn't really fly in today's times. For example, and this is Nonemacher's example. So Nonemacher says, for example, if I wrote a new book entitled The King of Bracelets, and basically retold the whole account of The Lord of the Rings in my own words, I would get into a lot of legal trouble. In the ancient Near East, however, my book would be considered a part of the Lord of the Rings tradition or thought, and anything I wrote would be put under the wing of Tolkien. So the next important detail concerning authorship is how the book of Isaiah is divided up. Most scholars think that the book of Isaiah is actually 3 smaller books that are all woven together. First is chapter 1 through 39, which is called Proto or First Isaiah. This one's mostly concerned with the man Isaiah and his life in Jerusalem. He lived in Jerusalem and was actually very connected to the Jewish royal court. And he lived somewhere between 742 and 700 BC. Second part of the book of Isaiah is chapters 40 through 55, which is called Second Isaiah or Deutero Isaiah. And there's a lot of discussion about who this author might have been. But either way, he carries Isaiah's message forward right up into the exile. And last is chapters 56 through 66, which is called Third Isaiah. And this shows the Isaiah tradition that's carried over into post-exile. Now, it is important to note that scholars do argue about was there one Isaiah. So John Oswald, who taught at Asbury Seminary, has written a commentary in which he argues that there was just one Isaiah who wrote all 3 parts or all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah. But most modern scholars think that there were actually 3 authors who contributed to the book of Isaiah. So we're going to go with that for this class. But I do want you to know that that debate is out there. And it's okay. Scholars debate about these things all the time. It's okay. Let's dive a little deeper into Isaiah's historical context. First, Isaiah houses 3 big events. First is what is called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis, which is about the year 735 BC. By this point, you'll recall that Israel had already split into the 2 nations of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This crisis around 735 is basically the northern king pressuring Judah, the southern kingdom, to offer a unified front against Assyria, which was rising in power and becoming very threatening. Assyria became the big baddies of the ancient Near East, and they were known to be ruthless and cruel. So they were beginning to threaten Israel and Judah, and this is partially because this tract of land where Israel sits, Palestine, was a natural gateway between the Middle East and the East and Africa. And it was a great way to get around. Trade routes went that way. And so whoever owned that chunk of land, which is Palestine, basically had a monopoly on the trade routes going down to that area. So it's good to know. So Assyria is rising in power, and Israel's pressuring Judah to, let's join together so that we can fight against the Assyrians, which seems to make sense, right? But Isaiah tells Judah that no alliance with foreign nations, including Israel, are allowed, and that Yahweh should be their full source of strength. Many of the oracles or words from God through Isaiah address this issue. Second, Assyria tries to invade Judah in the year 711 BC. Isaiah says, "Don't worry, Yahweh will deliver us," and that's exactly what actually happens. Third is the Assyrian siege of 701 BC performed by Sennacherib, and there are actually several historical accounts of this siege from the Israelite side and actually from the Assyrian side as well. So you can actually probably just do a search online and find an Assyrian account of this attempted attack and siege of Jerusalem. Anyways, Isaiah has a message from God and says Yahweh will deliver us. And sure enough, Sennacherib ends up retreating from Jerusalem, going home, and I think he's killed by his sons in a coup. So that's kind of interesting. So there are some prominent themes in the book of Isaiah, and it's good for us to touch on. What is this message from God? Throughout the Old Testament, and particularly in the books of the prophets, we hear, "Thus saith the Lord," or "This is what God says." I think it's 5,800 times in the Old Testament we get those words, "Thus saith the Lord," or "This is what God says." So what is God saying through the prophet Isaiah? Well, here's some of the themes. Social justice, just like in Amos, which we'll read later, is a prominent theme. So this involves care for the poor, and care for the oppressed. You should know that this is a theme that is all throughout the Old Testament. So care for the poor, care for those who are hurting is not just a Jesus thing, not just a New Testament idea. This is something that God demonstrates throughout the Old Testament. Care for the poor, care for the widow, care for the oppressed, care for the foreigner. Look after those people. Right? So this is one of the messages from Isaiah, a word from God saying, you're not doing what you should be doing. Care for these people, love them, help them, make sure they're not going hungry and starving. In addition to this, the fall of the proud and the arrogant is prominent. Another theme is the personification of Jerusalem as Lady Zion. For example, she can be seen, Lady Zion, lamenting to Yahweh for letting foreigners attack her. Babylon, the nation of Babylon, is also personified. This dynamic may prove to be even more interesting once we begin discussing wisdom literature in this course, such as the books of Proverbs, where personification is used quite a bit, including personification of wisdom, and even personification of the Spirit. So interesting. The last theme, again discussed in 2nd Isaiah, is the theme of the suffering servant. Please feel free to read that article that I put on D2L to learn more about that conversation. Overall, Isaiah's role in the Hebrew Bible cannot be overemphasized, as it heavily addresses the Assyrian military campaigns and the effect that they have on the people. All right. See you next lecture.